My name is Christy Mora, and I am on the team here at Generis, and welcome to the Reimagining Your Church Facilities workshop. We are delighted to be co-hosting today's conversation with our friends at Foundry. And before I invite our Generis Principal, Brad Leeper, to get us started and kick off our workshop today, I have just a little bit of housekeeping. So this workshop will be recorded. I saw somebody asked because they need to pop off early, but yes, this will be recorded, and we will share a copy of the recording in a follow-up email, as well as information of how to connect with Generis and Foundry. And if there are any resources that our speakers shared today, we'll include that in the follow-up email. After the presentation, we'll move into a Q&A session, and we saw so many great questions come in during registration. So as the presentation is going on, feel free to drop more questions down in that Q&A feature, and go ahead and use the chat. I know some of you are already doing it to introduce yourselves. Let us know where you're tuning in from. So, all right, Brad, I'm going to go ahead and shift this over to you, and then we'll launch a poll shortly after.
Great, Christy, thank you. Based on the questions that came in on the registration here, this should be a stellar experience. From how do we afford property, how do we create outdoor space, how do we get creative and reimagine our facilities. To help guide you in your thinking along with your board and leadership team, we have two of the best on the planet who can help us reimagine the facilities. Matt Messier is with Foundry Commercial based out of Orlando. Foundry is a huge commercial development and a real estate firm. They have a specialty unit in the faith-based religious side, and Matt runs that team. Matt's been working with faith-based institutions and property and real estate for over 30 years, coupled with this overall Foundry expertise in the private development world. Matt is able to look down the horizon and to see trends that are in the marketplace that can speak well into the church space as well. Greg Ligon is with the Generis team, the effective ministry team. Greg has been one of those rare people that can indeed look over the horizon like Matt and see what's coming before most other people. Greg has been part of the Multisite movement over the last 20 years, church mergers and acquisitions, written several books in those areas, and Greg spends a good bit of his time working within this area. I know some of the churches, nationally known churches that Greg is working with, and while you can't reveal some of those projects, I'm sure for confidentiality reason, it's a riot to see what's going on and what people are thinking. And you're going to bring that voice and that perspective into the conversation today. So Matt and Greg, thank you for your expertise and for guiding us through that. I'll be facilitating the conversation, but Christy, let's move to the polls to get a sense of what's our audience thinking, and we can get a quick grasp of the current realities.
Absolutely. So I'm going to go ahead and launch this first one. We have two questions. The first one is your current building designed to be used for anything other than your services? Okay, so I'm watching the results come in. Okay, here we go. And
wow, that's interesting, Christy.
Wow, yeah, that is overwhelmingly in one direction.
Right. That is, but great opportunity that Greg and Matt will speak into is that maybe how to change that landscape here.
I was gonna say, who's in that 82% is in the right conversation today. All right, so let me go ahead and launch our second one. This one's a little shorter. Did you have to close a campus during COVID because the portable facility that you were using became unavailable? And we see this a lot: schools, theaters, other mixed-use type places. All right, just a few more people responding. Okay. There we go. So 82% was a no, which is great that they are still able to keep their facilities open. Right. Okay.
Very good.
Also surprising. Okay, Greg, take it on.
Yeah, you bet. Thanks, Christy. And thank you all for joining us today. We, as Brad said we have a little brief presentation we want to share with you, but primarily we want to get to your questions. And I think that some of the things you guys are interested in, we're going to share a few things will help prompt some really good discussion around that. I know one of the things, I'm going to share screen here and see if I can get the deck to work here. Here we go. So I know, we've been at this new normal for about 19 months now. The craziness that happened as COVID began. And there's a couple of things I think that are really important for us to think about as we think about these issues related to facilities. And the first question we want to ask is, what's your posture? There was some research that I found early on, actually was uncovered by McKinsey, by a doctor named Arthur Frank, who did some research on chronically ill patients. And as he did the research and followed these chronically ill patients, several things he discovered. They fell into three groups. One he called the restitution group. This group only could think about how much better life was before, and everything was focused on getting back to the way it used to be. The second group he called the chaos group. They'd lost sight of the past, but yet they couldn't imagine what the future might hold. And so they kind of stewed in the present. I described this as what my mother-in-law was like during COVID, because she'd been in an assisted living place. She actually was loving this place. And then all of a sudden she was trapped there and wasn't able to get out. And we weren't able to have kind of interaction with her. And she couldn't imagine what it might look like. So this chaos kind of place. And then the third group that he studied were what he called the quest. And these individuals met the unchanging circumstances head on. They accepted them, they incorporated them as a part of their identity, and then part of the reality, and really kind of began to see this as a journey. And as you might imagine, those are the ones who fared best as they walked through the stages of their chronic illness. So as we think about kind of what we've been through over the last 19 months, what's your posture? Is your church one that's retreating? Is your church one that's kind of hanging on, just waiting for this thing to pass? I think we all felt that, and we all hope that for a period of time. Or are you really at a place where you're willing to innovate? And that's where some of the things that we feel like we're seeing are happening in the terms of facilities. There are kind of three things, kind of three plays that you'll see in terms of what happened, or three plays in terms of what's happening as we innovate. One were some of the pandemic adjustments that were made. Second, we're going to talk about is location, location, location. And then thirdly, we'll talk about missional moves. But first of all, pandemic adjustments. For those of you who are multi-site, or even if you weren't multi-site, there are many churches that began to use venues. They would take different portions of their building that had not formerly been used as worship space and began to use them as a venue that allowed them to be able to maximize the number of people that could be in their building and still be able to meet the social distancing expectations. They also were some greater experimentation that happened here in terms of unique kind of venues, family ministry venues, those kinds of things. So that was one of the things that happened. Also microsites, we began to see microsites kind of, those have been coming, been a part of the conversation for 3 to 5 years, but kind of really began to be a new wave of that. And many of you are familiar with some of those models. 12 Stone Home is doing a great job with that. And there are a number of models that are happening in that space. And then of course, everybody went online. Immediately. I was with a group of next gen pastors on March 10th. Whenever they get that dinner, somebody got the ESPN alert that there was going to be no crowd at March Madness. And by the time we gathered the next morning, we knew that there would be no one would be gathering for worship on the weekend. So everybody went online. And as we've gone through the last 19 months, we've seen some of the innovation that's happened first on what's happening online, but then also what's happening in this hybrid model. And so there's a lot of that kind of innovation. That's another of the pandemic adjustments that's happened. And then the last one I'd say is this placement. And so there are a couple of you that mentioned that you had a campus that had to close because you've been a part of a portable facility. We've seen that a lot. Organizations, churches that were in a school, and the schools, of course, weren't open for a period of time. And so that's one of the challenges and one of the adjustments that was made during this season of COVID. Which really leads us then to this idea of location, location, location. So, and that's really where some of our story with Matt and Foundry began to come into play as we began to talk about churches that were trying to figure out, okay, how do we find the right location that really enables us to execute our mission? And so I want to kind of pass it off to Matt, have him share a little bit about some of the things that Foundry has done and kind of how they operate. We're going to talk a little bit about this role of location and maximizing and kind of reimagining what your church facilities might look like. Matt?
Yeah, thank you and good morning, everyone. I'll jump in and as was mentioned previously, there were a lot of questions. And so really we're here for you. So if you have questions, please, I guess, put it in the chat or whatever, and we'll do our best to answer them. But to kind of go back to what Greg was talking about on the pandemic, and again, you're all pretty much aware of this, but one of the questions that we started hearing or comments that we started hearing from a lot of churches was, for the longest time, we were a geographic church with a digital online presence. But after COVID, we're finding out we're really an online church with a geographic presence. And why that matters is where are you going to put your capital expenditures and so forth in a new way of how to reach people. So where a lot of times the idea is, well, we need another location here, or we need to expand the building because of this. It's, we can start doing a lot more online and invest there and maybe not have to have as many locations or have our locations in set up in a much different way. One of the other things from the pandemic, as Greg was talking about, is for the longest time there was groups who are saying, hey, we don't want to own real estate, and are in movie theaters and in schools. Matter of fact, I'm working with a group right now. We actually helped them sell their building years ago, and they are renting theaters and we're doing great, and just church was growing. And then when COVID hit, they found themselves at the mercy of somebody else, and now they can't meet. And so just 6 months ago, they engaged us, and we just leased a 7-year deal with them because they did not want to be for their worship and their meeting to be tied to somebody else's decisions. So and then the last thing I want to kind of bring up, and then we can talk about what we're seeing in trends, is a lot of churches became dependent on leasing some of their facilities out to like schools and groups like that. Our church, for example, we leased to a number of smaller schools. And when the pandemic hit, suddenly all that income was shut off because they couldn't meet. And so one of the lessons I think we learned is a church really needs to try to be dependent on their tithing to run their operating costs, because if you become too dependent on somebody else, again, you could end up in a lot of trouble. So, and Greg, you kind of direct me, because one thing if you guys have never talked to me, I could talk all day, and it may be something that you're not even interested in, but I find it interesting. So
you're doing a great job, Matt. You're at least completing sentences today, so I love that.
Thank you. Well, I'm good. Working on it. And
let me interject one thing here. Matt hasn't said a whole lot about kind of how Foundry operates, but one of the things is we've talked with churches, particularly around real estate, as they begin to think about, the different models. We're going to talk about some of those in a minute, some of these kind of missional kind of models. But even if they're just talking about real estate and thinking about where they're going to place their next campus, they're bumping up against some challenges. They may have a couple of real estate people in their church, but typically the real estate people in their church don't necessarily know church real estate. Matt, one of the benefits of Foundry is Matt is the director of their whole church area. He's been doing this for 50 plus years. His dad started doing this years ago, but then they also have access to all the commercial expertise and skills associated with a large real estate company like Foundry, who does property brokerage and all those services for really large corporations, those of which we can't say their names. But as Matt says, you might have somebody with a small mark on their truck drop something off at your house today. So they have a lot of expertise in that background. One of the things is we were just talking with a church last week about this, and they have some really good real estate people in their place. But one of the challenges was they can't get people to actually talk to them because they know they're a church. And so they kind of bump up against some of those kind of challenges. One of the things that Matt has the ability and Foundry has the ability to do is begin to have some of those conversations from a neutral perspective, So that's one of the values that they bring. But then I think the other thing that Matt really has as a real value that he brings in the church area brings is they have deep relationships with denominations. And so oftentimes there's a property that comes on that is going to come on the market that nobody can see. But he has, because of the relational depth that they have, there's some opportunity to kind of take advantage of some of those properties from a merger perspective, if you would. Matt, just say a few more words about kind of the work that you guys do at Foundry, and then we'll jump on. I want to talk about some of these different kind of missional opportunities, and I know there are a lot of questions related to that as well.
Yeah, just real briefly. I see people from Denver and other areas. We're headquartered in the Southeast U.S. in Orlando, but we have an office in Dallas and Southern California. So we lease and manage about 60 million square feet of office retail, and really, the group that I head up, our goal is to help the church be a good steward. And we take a lot of the lessons and a lot of things that we do for Fortune 500 companies and bring it to the not-for-profit world. So again, every dollar your church saves can go back into reaching someone for Christ. And that, from a cultural standpoint, is really important to us. I'll stop there. I don't want to come across too salesy, but I appreciate the pitch, Greg. But the goal, I think the thing that Greg was really trying to maybe hit is that oftentimes the church, even if you have some good brokers and so forth, didn't leverage their property correctly. They didn't leverage their presence in the community to the extent that they could, that you see for-profit groups doing. And so what can we do to help the church fulfill its mission with using real estate as one of the tools within the arsenal to better do church? So on this Missional Moves, if anybody's ever heard me talk, my mantra is that ministry dictates real estate doesn't dictate ministry. And we'll find people that have a building or a property. Oh, we have this, we need to use it. Well, maybe, but let's figure out let's look at everything through the lens of ministry to see if this is the proper tool for you to be able to fulfill the mission of the church. And so oftentimes people are trying to kind of put the old square into the circle hole, and it's not working. You might be able to push it in there and kind of make it work, but in reality, that's not what's best for the church. So it's not a matter of just selling the property. It may be, hey, do we redevelop it? Do we make some changes within the building? There's lots of options out there. And Greg, I'll let you jump in and prod me to talk about this or that.
Yeah, I'm just going to share a few stories, and then Matt, as you have other stories, feel free to jump in as well. I'm working with a church in Baltimore area. They have 80 acres, and one of the things that they're looking to do is they actually made a decision to expand their worship facility and raise the money for it, and then COVID hit, and so now they're made a decision not to expand their worship space, and they're beginning to think about how can we best use those resources to serve our community. And so one of the things that they're looking at is using a portion of their property to meet ministry needs associated with the community. They're in an area that has a lot, and one of the things they're looking at is they're in an area that has a lot of youth sports and very little facilities for youth sports to meet in. And so they're looking at some options for sprung structures that could provide a space for students and for student athletes to have practice, but also there might also be a venue on their facilities that could serve as a campus as well, or as a venue on their initial campus. They also have a portion of that that's residential, so they're looking at some possibilities of it's zoned that they could do some group home kind of facility and operation there too. So that's one of the ways that people are beginning to think about that. How can we serve the community, use this as a place to really serve, but then also use it as a place to get people on our property to be exposed to the other work that we're doing in that context as well. Some of you this has been a very public one. National Community Church in the DC area is working with Phase, and they've just opened a child care facility that is a revenue generating thing, but is also serving as a part of their mission and their ministry. National Community is a great example of this kind of model because they also have a coffee shop, Ebenezer's, that they built and run, and the resources from that fund their work in missions literally around the world. It also happens to serve as a campus. It's one of the places they record their video for some of their campuses and their multi-site model. So another example of how mixed use space is being used. One other church, Community Christian Church, you also may be familiar with in the Chicago area, has a campus. They partnered with a real estate group, Aspen Group, and their design build firm, and actually have a campus that serves similar to what the church I was mentioning in the Baltimore area. They have a campus that serves as an indoor facility for soccer. And so they have a partnership with the property management group, this group that they actually built it with, that runs that part of the facility. But then again, they're using that facility and portions of it for their campus. And then finally, one other church that we're just in beginning conversations with, but they're exploring the possibility of actually taking a strip center or an area, a retail area, where there's some opportunity to be able to get several of the pieces of property or several of the areas within that retail development, and really developing a little bit of a Main Street kind of feel that would give them a place for a campus again for one of their campuses for their sites, but then also is going to have some multiple different kinds of things, perhaps a coffee shop, perhaps a daycare, perhaps a splash pad kind of area that would help, again, getting people onto the campus, if you would, meeting some of those needs, creating places for connection. So those are some of the stories, some of the churches that I'm working with currently. Matt, other ones that you've worked with that you feel like would be good to insert at this point in time?
Yeah, and I think this really points to a trend that we're going to see more and more. And again, I have all these things I'd like to talk about, but the trend is the idea of the church back in the day. When I was growing up, 58 years old, we went to church Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday night, and that's pretty much when the building was open. And it was, a place you went to, you had worship, and that's it. I think we're going to see some dramatic changes in that structure over the next 5, 10, 15 years. And where, again, probably in the next 10 years, 20% of the mainline denominational churches are going to close. You're going to see where the church needs to embed itself more into, not just into the community, but what the community is doing. Going back, to the New Testament church and in many respects. And so just a quick couple examples is the Christian and Missionary Alliance. They with two stories real quick, but they had a church in Salem, Oregon, which is the state capital there. And they had there was some land across the street that was owned by the city. And they tried getting it. They wanted to build a fellowship hall and some more classrooms, and the city would never sell it. And then finally they said, hey, we'll sell it, but you got to keep the ground floor and the tax rolls. And so they end up building something called Broadway Commons, largest coffee shop, I think, in the city. They have medical there for people that are in need. They have conference space that they let not-for-profits use for free. And I think their first year, they had over like 13,000 hours of use on the space. They have a nice restaurant. But here's the key, was that the newspaper called Broadway Commons the city's living room. And this is where the city goes to, like a living room. And so the idea was this, where church, community, and commerce could all come together. And we just actually, they took that on another level. We just relocated the CMA headquarters from Colorado Springs. We sold their 60,000 square foot office building there and moved them to Reynoldsburg, Ohio. And they are now going to build about a 200,000 square foot event center, offices, restaurants, etc. And the goal is, hey, let's create all this income stream or nothing, or something like that. That's really not the goal. The goal is this idea of community coming together with commerce and church, where everything is intertwined. And I like what the president of the CMA says. He says, those who are in the mission need to be on mission. And so that's where I think we're going to see on a much smaller level. You can go as high, up the food chain, if you will, that you want. But you're going to see, for churches to thrive and grow, that they're going to have to embed themselves and become an integral part of the community that they serve. The Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday night model still will work for some people. But if you want to be on offense, I think that's where you're going to see. So that's just one example, Greg. And the other one real quick, and again, I keep going back to the idea of ministry dictating real estate. We just worked with a group that wanted, their ministry was really to college students. This was actually here in Orlando. And they were near University of Central Florida, but not near enough where students and stuff would come to them. And they had a beautiful piece of property, a 50,000 square foot church and all that, but students, it was not enticing to who they're trying to reach. They were approached by a developer, offered $2.5 million or something like that for their property. And we were brought in by the conference. And bottom line is, and this is kind of a warning to those when you get approached by developers, really do your homework. Ended up taking the property to the market with no asking price, sold it, ended up selling for $6.5 million. And what was neat is they were able to take those funds and relocate very close to UCF in an environment that was much more conducive to trying to reach students. Free Wi-Fi, come and get your coffee. You can easy to walk to or bike, those type of things. And so they were able, in this case, to leverage their real estate in such a way, not to shut down, but they said, we want to quit playing defense. We want to start playing offense. And so they repurposed their property in a way of selling it to move. But we've seen other people repurpose their property without moving and being able to do all kinds of things. So I would say the trend, and again, I'll shut up, Greg, but this idea, we talked about retreat and different groups. You're either on offense, you're on defense. If you're green, you grow. If you're ripe, you rot. And so the idea of just reimagining the church, how do we reach people, staying fresh, anyway, I'll shut up.
That's good. No, those are really, really great examples. One last thing I'll say, because you mentioned a little bit in terms of a number of the facilities and churches that just aren't going to make it. If you listen to Barna or Ed Stetzer, they're saying 20% of churches won't make it. And there's going to be an increase in the opportunity for mergers during this period of time. And so that's another piece that's a part of this conversation. In some cases, it's a campus that could be used for a particular space. Again, this church I'm working with in the Baltimore area is thinking about using a portion of those resources to establish a campus in a neighboring community that would be primarily focused at kind of a community service kind of network area where they'd be helping to help recent folks who've been in prison kind of re-establish themselves in the community. So there's some really unique opportunities, I think, in terms of some of those spaces as well. So I think we've talked enough and you guys have a lot of questions. Brad, anything you'd want to say just in terms on the generosity side of things? And obviously a lot of these things we're talking about require some money. And so anything that you're hearing and seeing with reference to opportunities on that side as well.
Thank you, Greg. Three main ideas that we're seeing unfold this fall. Number one, now's a great time to raise funds. The environment is very good economically. We're already seeing significant gifts being invested in projects like you and Matt are describing. So it's a great time to raise funds. Secondly, especially major givers, Greg, are intrigued with innovative projects. They're less inclined to get excited about more traditional church projects and more excited about how can we reimagine the facilities. They're more inclined to invest larger dollars in the innovation side and something that makes sense. I had a conversation about an hour ago with a church that is redesigning the exterior of their building because of a park that got put in and a major development, commercial development, and they're allowing these commercial developments and new intersections with the community to reflect how they redesign at least the exterior of their church, and very clever in how they're tapping into that. So major givers especially are intrigued with bold ideas like this. And then thirdly, Greg, congregations are more inspired by churches that are innovative and are seeking ways to engage the community and allowing the facilities as a way to be able to do that. We all are very curious about engagement going forward as we raise the bar and invite people into mission. Those churches seem to be thriving better than churches that are more passive. Those churches that are thriving around mission tend to see more financial resources unleashed for the project. So, Greg, let's assume that there's some money here. Help us, come on, give us some more ideas here. How do we innovate and reimagine our facilities?
Well, some of the things we've already talked about, but I think I'd love just to kind of open it up to some of the questions. We've shared some of the models, but if you have specific questions, Christy, I believe people have the ability to unmute themselves and ask the question. Is that accurate?
Hey, Greg, unfortunately, no, because we are on a webinar.
Okay, my bad.
Call. But everyone, I do want to remind you, at the bottom of your screen, you have the Q&A feature. You can drop in some questions. And I think we can also pull some from registration.
Yeah, here are a couple ones that are fascinating to me. How do you afford real estate in a hot market right here? Matt, you buy and sell properties for churches and religious organizations. How do we handle a hot market like this?
That's a good question. And a hot market is, it depends what your assets are. If you have something to sell, so you can buy something, that makes it even better. But the idea of waiting for a better time or for the market to fail or to lessen actually has ramifications down the line as far as your people giving and so forth. So in my mind, it's a result of the strength of your church. In other words, there's never going to be the perfect time to buy property or to lease a building, whether the market is hot or not. It really comes down to what is the ability of your church to get a property, because the strength of your church should be growing in comparison as far as giving and so forth to what's happening outside in the market. So to me, whether you're in a down market, a strong market, it really comes down to, is your church set up in order to be able to take advantage of the right property? A lot of times churches will say, "Oh, I got this really good deal on this piece of dirt," or it's a hot market and I was able to get it below, but the due diligence wasn't done. Oh, we've just found out we got to hook up to sewer and it's a quarter mile away, and we got to spend another $500,000 to hook up to sewer. You know what I mean? And so I would say that the more important question is, how do we find the right property in a hot market? Mm-hmm. And that will be able to, again, allow us to do the mission that we've been called to do. And quite frankly, that's sometimes a little harder, Brad, because of the competition out there. Sorry.
I'm sure. So Greg, as we think about the property, some other questions that came in are, now that we don't have the same physical attendance, we have this online attendance, as nebulous as that number might be. Should we err on the side of putting all of our chips or more of our chips in the online and not pay attention to our facility? Or do we try to adapt the facility and perhaps pay less attention to the online audience? Or is there a common? I was yesterday, it was in a church that they created their production room for their online service right at the entrance of the building. So as people come in for the first time, they look to the right, like, that's the room we know online. Very genius, all glass and very transparent in that. It wasn't cheap, but it was a nice touch. So help us find that elusive balance between online and investing in facilities.
Yeah, so I think that the fact that you mentioned that studio, that is a common thing that we're hearing a lot. People are building using existing space, again, kind of reimagining your facilities. So they're using a portion of their building to create a studio that gives them the ability to broadcast their online services, but also probably more than that is, or as important as that, is just a place where they can develop digital content that's going to be a part of what it means to be the church moving forward. It's an opportunity where they have a podcast, or whether it's actually creating kids ministry content. So that's one of the things that we're seeing a lot of, is people actually building studios in. I think the thing that it's a dance, right? Because we started off in March of 2020, and everybody had to go online, and there was a whole lot of innovation that happened in those first 8 weeks. And then as soon as people began to talk about the opportunity to kind of be back in the building and be in person, a lot of the innovation that happened kind of got put on hold a bit. And then because we just kept thinking, okay, we're going to be back in the building, we're going to be back in the building. The good things that did happen during that time was, even if you were live streaming, you learned some things about live streaming. So at least that's a better experience. But I think the churches that are really are making the investments currently in what will be a part of the future are the ones who've really taken some time to focus on both of those pieces. Larry Osborne out at North Coast says now they will have both an in-person and an online champion. He's one of the guys that Matt mentioned earlier that said, we've always thought of ourselves as a geographic or a physical church with an online presence. And he said, we're thinking about that exactly the opposite now. We're an online church with physical expressions. One of the things that he says, and there's a lot of kind of disagreement, or not necessarily disagreement, but different perspectives on this. He said, going before the pandemic, if I had somebody who was attending my church, they were there 2 Sundays out of 4, which we know from the statistics is generous in many cases. But if they were 2 out of 4 and they were involved in a small group and they were serving somewhere, I would have still been pushing our team to say, okay, how do we get them to that 3rd Sunday and that 4th Sunday? He said, I really don't care where they get their content. He said, discipleship is about 2 things. 1, it's about where you get your content. And 2, it's about doing life together and how that gets applied. And so he said, if I knew somebody was getting their content, they were streaming our services on a weekend, or they were even streaming somebody else's services on a weekend, but they were involved in a group and they were serving somewhere, he said, I would count that good. They're being discipled. And so there's a lot of it. I mean, it's a wild, wild west a little bit in learning what the balance is associated with some of these. Working with most of the churches that we've worked with did do some shift in their staffing during this last 18 months to add more capacity on the online side of things. There are some that are, these are kind of few and far between, but some have made really radical shifts and said, hey, we've moved to 50% of our staff is dealing with online related things. I think the other thing that's real key in that conversation is to think about online, not just in terms of the worship experience, not just what happens on the weekend, but to really think overall about what your digital strategy is and how you're going to engage people. So hopefully that's a little bit of insight into that piece, Brad.
Mm-hmm. What's the tension point, Greg, or how do you solve the tension point between my operating budget is a fixed pie? We've done well in giving. We're pretty much at budget, but it doesn't seem to be growing 5%. We're not decreasing, but we're not increasing. I have to open the building, as one question came in. I have to open the building and run it, church like pre-COVID, but we want to do this other stuff, which requires staff, and I don't necessarily have the budget to do both. How do I decide? Do I place a primary emphasis on the existing church programming, or do I make that shift? Give us some guidance as to what you're seeing across the country.
Yeah, so it kind of falls into 3 buckets, and it's really kind of driven by a theological or maybe even just a philosophical perspective of what it means to be the church. And some would say, hey, it's not really the church unless you are in person and we're looking at each other eyeball to eyeball, and that's it. And so those are not going to really make much investment at all in the online. They may still, stream their service or record it and throw it up on their website a day or 2 later. The middle group are those who still believe that it's preferred for everyone to be gathered. and that's what they're driving toward. It's important to them. They're going to make a little bit different investment because they realize that there are some people that aren't able to attend. And they're going to kind of focus on that audience. It may be those who are a regular part of have been a part of their community and they're traveling, or it may be, a demographic that's not coming back because of their concerns related to COVID. But they're still going to but it's a bigger investment than the first group, but not as much as the third group. The third group would say is digital's here to stay. There are very few of them that are only saying we're just digital, although there are some examples of that, but many are saying it's both. And so we have to be willing to make, a different kind of investment in the online side of things. And so they're investing in both, staffing from that perspective, programming from that perspective. Again, looking at, from a broader digital strategy, not just what happens on the weekend. That's part of where sometimes people get hung up a little bit in terms of what the investment looks like. Because this is not, the most healthy models are not just about what happens in a weekend experience, but what happens throughout the week online, from the online perspective as well. Just one quick example, maybe two quick examples on that. One of the things that, in kind of figuring out this hybrid, this model, one of the things that many churches determined worked really, really well during COVID, and they're staying with it, is some of their small group gatherings. In particular, those families that had young kids. I've talked with probably 30 churches that said, hey, we had greater attendance. The families that were part of that said, hey, I can be more engaged if I know my kids. I put my kids down at night and I can actually be more engaged than if I'm in somebody else's home worrying about whether or not they're tearing something up upstairs or I had to get a babysitter, whatever. So some of those kinds of things will stay online. Any kind of new member processes, consistently having people say, hey, we actually have better attendance and people are more vulnerable and transparent as they kind of share their story about how they got connected to this church. So I think those are some of the factors that you have to think about. And then it's a budget decision, right? It's a leadership decision you have to make in terms of how you're going to make those investments. I think one of the key things is understanding who it is that you're investing in, whether it's online or in person.
Which a great transition to a question that was asked by a participant here. For those of us who have designed our building to be used for other specific purposes other than church uses, is there some kind of ROI, return on investment, as far as folks who come for coffee or a soccer game who then attend the church? That's an elusive formula, I believe. But Greg, how are people doing the cost benefit analysis for this number of dollars? We translate that into what in keeping the metrics around our mission?
Yeah, so I think part of that has to do with how effectively you measure, in general. One of the things that some of the churches I'm aware of, so for example, let's go with Mark Batterson National Community. Their metric associated with that and having that campus and that investment is about their missions reach. And so that's effective. They want that to succeed from a financial perspective because the more money they make, the more money they're able to invest in missions. And so that's the metric that they would use. Some of the churches that we're talking with, and they're looking at these kind of locations that are bring people onto the campus for some other purpose outside of church, whether it's a coffee shop or a sports facility. It really depends on how smart they are about being able to track who's there. Some of the churches do a great job of, particularly take a sports youth facility, being able to be very visible and intentional about engaging with the families, and as appropriate, being able to follow up with them and do those kinds of invitations. So in those cases, they're looking at that as kind of a funnel, if you would, as an ability to kind of attract people to their church, to give an awareness of their church in the community, so that when people are looking for a church, there's that visibility that's there as well.
Greg, and Matt, a philosophical question here, and I'll put an illustration in here after I ask the question. I can either open my facility for community use, come in, teacher meeting, weddings, whatever that turns out to be. That could have some tax implications in terms of unrelated business income tax. Or do I flip the church and make it a Monday through Saturday facility, and I I turn it into a church on Sunday and flip it back. Phase and their model leans in that direction. I have a client now that just purchased a YMCA. They opted to discontinue the 17-acre sports facility, and they're turning it into a multi-site, which would be pretty cool, and putting in a couple $2 million for that. But effectively, they purposely purchased a building and a facility that gives them a wide open invitation to the community to come to walk on it, movie nights, farmers markets, whatever it is. So help us understand, do I just open the doors Monday through Saturday and cross my fingers, or do I really move into the business of engaging the community Monday through Saturday? That's a hard call.
Mm-hmm. Matt, anything you would say with reference to that?
Yeah, a couple of things is when you talk about ROI, I guess, how do you measure success? And, is it in attendance? And so just a quick example. So one is, there's things you do because you're trying to provide income in order to do ministry. And there's things you do because it is ministry. And so just an example with our church, we sold land to United Cerebral Palsy to build a charter school. So they deal with special needs kids. So they just built a 25,000 square foot school. But we saw that as a ministry opportunity to reach families, to reach parents, to, hey, come, and when you drop your kids off, have a coffee at our place. If you have some other kids, we got a playground inside that you can use. And if you want to talk to our minister, that type of thing. So I would say that a lot of folks, and I'll just use the school model, that a lot of folks will, let's have a school, and then the people who attend our school will come to our church. I mean, that's probably less than 1%. And the people are dropping their kids off because it's a good education and it's cheap compared to other things. So I think you really want to go in and saying, what is driving what I'm doing? Am I having a coffee shop in order to raise funds and be a really cool coffee shop with the latest types? I don't drink coffee, so coffee beans and where it's from and all that kind of stuff. Or is it really like, hey, we're down the street from a high school or from a school, and why don't we open up our building for an hour in the morning where parents who are going in early can drop their kids off in an inexpensive way. And again, it allows our people who are in the mission to be on mission. And so I don't know if that's a great answer, but I would say that you really need to distinguish what you're trying to achieve. And then that way you can measure, hey, it's a ministry, I'm not supposed to make money. Or I'm trying to leverage this in order to be able to do ministry. Greg?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. You got to know why. I think we sometimes get to the real estate question and we haven't really answered the why. And just going back to what you said, then the building begins to wag the whatever that, I can never remember.
The tail begins to wag the dog.
Begins to wag the dog, right? So the building begins to wag the ministry as opposed to the other way around. And so I think one of the things that's really key is to know why. Look at what your story is at your church. What's God's story? What's the story of the community? What's the story of your leadership? And figure out where those intersect to really drive what does this chapter, what does this next phase for your church look like? And then what role does the building, does the facility play in that? And that's exactly the process we're going through with this church in Baltimore. So we're looking at who is it they want to minister? Who is it that God's called them to minister to? And then based on that, what kind of decisions are we going to make in terms of facilities? So you have to answer that why question first.
And your building, as you were talking about, where the audio video, where things are taped when you come in. Yeah. And again, I'm just use our church. I know it. But when we started doing that, we've been called, I think, to reach special needs kids, just not locally, but in other countries. But we were in a very high growth area. All these new families were moving in. So the thought process was, well, how do we communicate? Well, everybody's welcome, but how do we use our building to communicate that we're really about kids? So when you walk into our lobby, you see a glassed in playground like you see at a mall. And then right across from it is our coffee area. So when people walk in, visually they're saying, wow, they must be really set up for kids. So when you talk about investing and stuff, Brad, to your previous question, you can really use your building in many ways to kind of show people, and it doesn't have to be super expensive, to show people what you're about. If you're really about kids and you're in an area where all new families in, probably having all your kid stuff in the very back of the building and, in the room where we don't think there's mold there, but, is probably not the best scenario. So I think there's a lot you can do with your existing structure to kind of work your ministry vision in it, as opposed to,
Greg, last question, and we could probably do a 4-hour session on this one. So you got to deliver really well in 180 seconds or less on this. I, as a leader, have the vision and the energy and the passion to invest in our facility and to make it work. However, I too am a man under authority, and I have a board that is more risk adverse and more reluctant. How do I take advantage of this moment and still have a board that won't fire me? How do I lead the board in thinking through this facility question? Even if 80% of the board's with me and I got 20% that are fighting it, give me some guidance here. How do I lead a board in this context?
Yeah, so I think, several things. One, it's about vision. You have to keep casting that vision. I think secondly, you have to be able to point to other examples where it's working. One of the things that I often encourage the church to do if they're exploring some of these new possibilities is to actually take their group of their elders to a church that's doing it, so they experience it, see it. They don't just hear about it, but they actually are immersed in what that experience looks like. I think another thing too is to two more things, I guess. One I would say is as you're beginning that process of beginning to dream about what this next facility might look like, it's helpful to have a team that's broader than just your elders beginning to dream about that and think about that. But it's also helpful to have a conversation with your elders about kind of what are the boundaries of the sandbox that we can play in. So like, for example, one of the things that is one of the boundaries for the sandbox and one of the churches I'm working with is we will not take on any new debt. We've already raised this amount of money. We're not going to take any new debt. So if any of the things that we talk about require that, that's off bounds. That's out of bounds in terms of that. So that's an important piece of it, I think. And then the last thing I would say is, look for the quick wins. So where are the things that you can do immediately that are a part of a larger vision that allow people to begin to experience, to see some things, see some dust flying, and to get some excitement around that in terms of a facility. And then that helps then both from your congregation, but then also from your leadership's buy-in and engagement with the process.
Very practical, very wise. Well, Greg, Matt, and Greg, tell us, if we want to have a conversation with either of you about, this is great, you've opened up the ideas here because it's confirming some of our impulse, but in our specific situation, we have these variables. How do I connect with you guys? And I'm assuming you'll give some consultation.
Yeah, you bet. I think Christy's going to drop in the chat a link. If you'd like to have a follow-on conversation, I'd be happy to speak with you and kind of answer any additional questions that you might have and begin to help you think about some options in terms of reimagining your church facilities. And then I'll kind of be your first point of contact. And then after we've had that initial conversation, we'll likely bring Matt and other members of his team into those conversations as well. Christy, I think you're going to drop that link in the chat where they can sign up for, it looks like it's there. You can sign up for an opportunity to do a 30-minute call for us to chat further about your specific area of need around the facilities.
Very good. Well, Matt, Greg, thank you for your expertise. And I'd love to have a similar conversation in a few weeks just to see what all wild ideas that you're coming up with. Some that I've heard you talk about, those don't have a chance, but those are the ones that God may use going forward. Who thought multi-site would ever work, right?
That's right.
And now it's all the norm with this. So you guys are perfect in innovation and helping churches think that through. So thanks for what you're doing. Keep keep doing it. We need it such a time as this. All right.
Thanks.
Thank you very much for joining us.
Great to be with everyone.
Privileged to serve everybody. Thank you.
God bless.